I want you to, actually, seriously, humor me for a second.
Okay.
I want you to close your eyes.
Okay, I'm playing along.
Imagine you are sitting on a terrace in Vienna. It is June 1913. The coffee is rich, the sun is hitting the pavement, and you're just, reading a newspaper. If you look around, what do you see? You see a world that feels completely, well, permanent.
Right. You see officers walking by in these brightly colored uniforms, blues and reds. You see electric trams going down the street. You see a society that believes, truly believes, down to its bones in progress, with a capital P.
And that's the key word, isn't it? Progress.
Absolutely. The mindset of 1913 Europe is strictly positivist. It's this very Victorian, highly optimistic belief that science, reason, and industry are taking humanity on a straight, uninterrupted line upward.
Like things will just keep getting better.
Exactly. They've cured diseases, they've mapped the entire globe, they've industrialized production to a level never seen before. There's this incredible arrogance, this hubris that European civilization has essentially solved the human condition.
It's the La Belle Epoque, the beautiful era. I mean, Europe basically controls the globe's economy at this point. Its empires stretch across all of Africa and Asia. It feels utterly invincible.
And that right there is why the contrast is so terrifying, because if you fast forward just 32 years, same city, same exact spot on that terrace. Summer of 1945.
It's just gone.
It's not just gone, it's obliterated. That beautiful cafe is a pile of radioactive rubble. The young men who were drinking coffee in 1913 are dead in trenches or frozen in the Russian snow, or they're ash in a crematorium.
Yeah.
The ancient empires are completely dissolved, Europe is bankrupt, the people are starving, and the continent is occupied by two massive foreign superpowers of the US and the Soviet Union.
And that whole idea of progress, that unshakable faith in science.
That's the darkest irony of all of this. Science didn't save them. Science built the gas chambers. Science built the V-2 rocket. Science built the atomic bomb. The so-called age of reason ended in the most irrational, industrialized slaughter in the history of our species.
That transition from the absolute hubris of 1913 to the absolute zero of 1945 is the story of the shattered century. And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are tackling the absolute monster of the curriculum today, AP European History Unit 8, 20th Century Global Conflicts.
And look, for the learner listening to this right now, this is the big one. This unit is 10 to 15% of your AP exam. But honestly, way more than just the test scores, this is the origin story of the world you live in right now today.
We aren't just going to list a bunch of bottles and dates.
No, not at all. We are doing a forensic analysis of how the modern world broke apart and how it was violently glued back together in a completely different shape.
We have a massive stack of notes in front of us. We're talking primary sources from the trenches, deep economic analysis of the Great Depression, the Wannsee Protocols. And our mission today is to answer one fundamental guiding question.
Which is, how did industrialized warfare, ideological extremism, and economic collapse transform Europe and permanently alter global power structures?
It's a heavy question, but it's essential. We're looking at the bookends here, starting in 1914 with the assassination and the guns of August, and going all the way up to the present day. Because, let's face it, we are still living in the geopolitical aftershocks of these specific conflicts.
We absolutely are. Everything from the borders of the Middle East to the existence of the United Nations traces back to this specific window of time.
So let's not waste any more time. We're slicing this deep dive into four massive parts to make it digestible. First, the Great War and the peace that failed. Second, the rise of the dictators and how people willingly embraced totalitarianism. Third, the economic collapse that made all of that possible. And finally, the cataclysm of World War II and the Holocaust.
Let's start with the catalyst for the entire catastrophe. Slice 1, Topic 8.2, World War I. Now, pretty much every history textbook throws the acronym MAIN at you. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism.
Right, which is, it's a great way to memorize a list for a multiple-choice question, but it's a pretty terrible way to actually understand a war.
Exactly, because lists don't start fires. People do. And systems do.
Right, because the sources we have describe the alliance system specifically as a tripwire. And I love that visual. But why was the wire pulled so tight? Why did a localized shooting in Sarajevo force a baker in Paris to suddenly pick up a rifle?
That is the million-dollar question. And to understand it, you have to look at the technology and the logistics of 1914. Specifically, and this sounds boring, but it's crucial, railroads.
Railroads. Okay, unpack that for us.
See, by 1914, the militarism part of that acronym meant that European powers had built these massive, massive conscript armies. We are talking millions of men in reserve. But you can't just snap your fingers and have a million men magically ready to fight on the border.
Right, they're at home, they're farming, working in factories.
You have to call them up, dress them, issue them weapons, and put them on trains to the front lines.
And trains run on very strict schedules.
Rigid, inflexible schedules. Historians call this the mobilization trap. Take the German war plan, the Schlieffen Plan. It was calculated down to the literal minute. If Russia started mobilizing its trains, Germany felt it had to start mobilizing theirs immediately.
Because if they waited...
If they waited even 24 hours to negotiate, they believed they would lose the war before a single shot was fired, simply because the Russians would get to the border first.
So it creates this massive hair trigger effect. The moment one single domino falls, the physics of the system just takes over.
Exactly. So when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo in June 1914, which, let's be totally honest, should have just been a localized diplomatic crisis between Austria and Serbia, the alliance tripwires kick in. Austria mobilizes against Serbia. Russia, acting as Serbia's big protector, mobilizes against Austria.
And suddenly the German Kaiser gets a panic telegram saying Russia is loading the trains.
And the German generals tell the Kaiser, "Sire, we have to push the button right now. We cannot stop the timetables." It completely removed the ability for diplomats to step in and say, "Hey, let's take a breath and talk this out." The train had literally and metaphorically left the station.
That is just terrifying. It's like they built a doomsday machine that, once switched on, couldn't be switched off by anybody.
And that machine fed right into the alliance structures. You have the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Italy, staring down the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia. Because of those train schedules, a conflict in the Balkans didn't stay in the Balkans. It pulled the wire, and the explosion happened in Belgium and France.
So the armies clash in August. And everyone, literally everyone in 1914 thinks this is going to be incredibly quick. The whole home by Christmas mentality.
That was the universal slogan, because they were operating on 19th century software in their heads. They thought war was still about glory, cavalry charges, brilliant flanking maneuvers.
And instead, they ran face first into 20th century hardware.
It's a tragic, brutal mismatch. You have generals trained in the 1800s ordering men in bright uniforms to charge across open fields right into the teeth of modern machine guns.
The industrialization of killing.
A single machine gun crew could wipe out an entire battalion in minutes. Then you add barbed wire, which stops any forward movement dead in its tracks. Then you add heavy industrialized artillery that can fire massive shells from miles away. The result is that forward movement becomes literal suicide. So what do you do to survive?
You dig.
You dig into the earth. And that creates the defining nightmare of the war, trench warfare, a continuous bleeding scar running from the Swiss border all the way to the North Sea. Millions of men living in mud, sharing their miserable rations with rats, dealing with trench foot, just waiting to die for a few inches of ground.
Our sources mention the concept of total war here, which is a massive AP theme. I feel like that term gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean for the average person living through it?
It means the battlefield is everywhere. In the 19th century, armies fought other armies. The civilians mostly watched from the sidelines. But in World War I, entire societies fought entire societies. The government takes complete control over the economy.
Like, factories that used to make corsets or bicycles are suddenly retooled to make artillery shells.
Exactly. You have mass rationing, heavy censorship, relentless state propaganda. And crucially, and this changes warfare forever, if the factory worker is suddenly vital to the war effort, then the factory and the worker become legitimate military targets.
It blurs the line between combatant and civilian.
Completely. The British naval blockade of Germany wasn't just stopping bullets and guns, it was deliberately stopping food. They were starving the civilian population to force the military to surrender. It was the turnip winter. People were eating grass.
And then you have the new technological horrors, poison gas.
Pure psychological terror.
Yeah.
Chlorine gas, mustard gas. Statistically, it didn't actually kill as many people as the artillery did. But the fear of it, the idea of imagining your lungs melting from the inside out, it permanently changed the psyche of the soldiers. And of course, Submarines.
The U-boats.
Right, taking the war under the waves, sinking unarmed merchant ships to cut off supply lines.
Which, of course, is what eventually drags the United States into the fight in 1917.
The U.S. really tries to stay out of it. Woodrow Wilson campaigned on keeping America out of the war. But in unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American ships, and the Zimmermann telegram where Germany basically tried to get Mexico to invade the U.S., it forced their hand. And once the Americans arrive with their fresh millions and massive industrial might, the balance finally tips.
So we get to November 1918, the armistice. The guns finally go silent. The silence must have been absolutely deafening to those men.
It was, but the Europe that emerged from the smoke was completely unrecognizable. 4 ancient, massive empires were just gone.
Let's list them, because this is a massive geopolitical shift for the AP exam.
The German Empire, gone. The Kaiser abdicates and flees to the Netherlands. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, completely dissolved into a dozen different pieces. The Ottoman Empire, collapsed. And the Russian Empire, fall into a radical revolution.
So the map makers at the peace conference basically have a field day.
They redraw the entire continent. Poland is back on the map after being erased for over a century. Czechoslovakia is entirely invented. Yugoslavia is stitched together from different Balkan groups.
And what about in the Middle East? Because that ties into the global consequence theme.
That's the mandate system. Britain and France look at the carcass of the Ottoman Empire and basically say, we'll take that. Britain takes Iraq and Palestine. France takes Syria and Lebanon. They call them mandates. Supposedly, they are preparing these regions for eventual independence. But let's be clear, it was just imperialism with a new coat of paint.
Which brings us to the room where they actually tried to fix all of this. Topic 8.4, the Treaty of Versailles.
The famous Hall of Mirrors.
I've always heard this treaty described as a peace built on quicksand. But why? You had the most powerful men in the world in that room.
You had a massive clash of visions that was fundamentally doomed to fail. On one side, you have Woodrow Wilson from the U.S. He's the ultimate idealist, a former university president. He wants peace without victory. He has his famous 14 points. He wants national self-determination and a League of Nations. He literally wants to save the world's soul.
And on the other side of the table,
you have Georges Clemenceau of France. They called him the Tiger. He doesn't care about the world's soul. He cares that France has been brutally invaded by Germany twice in his own lifetime. He wants to break Germany's legs so severely that it can never, ever walk into Paris again.
And David Lloyd George of Britain is stuck right in the middle, trying to balance European power, but also dealing with an angry British public that literally voted for him because he promised to, quote-unquote, hang the Kaiser.
Exactly. So the resulting treaty ends up being this bizarre Frankenstein monster. It's too harsh to be accepted by the Germans, but it's too weak to actually be enforced by the Allies.
Let's look at the specific terms for Germany, because this becomes the fuel for everything that comes next in the 20th century.
It was designed as a humiliation. First, they lose territory, about 13% of their land and all their overseas colonies. Second, the military is gutted. The German army is limited to 100,000 men, which is tiny. No air force allowed, no submarines. And the Rhineland, the industrial border region with France, is completely demilitarized.
But the money is the real crushing blow.
Reparations. They were billed 132 billion gold marks. It was a staggering number, explicitly designed to keep the German economy crippled for at least a generation.
And then the cherry on top, the psychological blow, Article 231.
The War Guilt Clause. Germany was forced to sign a legal document accepting sole responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the entire war.
That's not just a political concession. That's a deep psychological wound.
It was a national slap in the face. It created a deep, burning resentment that cut across all political lines in Germany. Every single German, from the radical communist to the staunch conservative, absolutely hated Versailles. They called it the Diktat, the dictated peace.
And the tragic irony is that the one mechanism designed to fix these future problems, the League of Nations, was broken from day one.
Because the United States didn't even join it. Wilson creates the whole idea, he champions it, but the U.S. Senate refuses to ratify the treaty. They want to go back to isolationism. So you end up with a League of Nations that has no standing army, no American backing, and absolutely no teeth to enforce its own rules.
So to summarize the first slice, the war ends militarily in 1918. But politically?
Politically, it was just a truce. It was a 20-year pause to reload.
Which brings us to our second slice. Because while the diplomats in the West are arguing over borders and money, the East is completely tearing itself apart. Let's look at topic 8.3, the Russian Revolution.
This is a crucial pivot point. You absolutely cannot understand the 20th century without understanding what happened in 1917.
We have to connect this back to World War I, right? Cause and effect.
Right. The war was the ultimate catalyst. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, was an out-of-touch autocrat trying to lead a fundamentally agrarian, backward country into a modern, industrialized, total war. It was an absolute disaster from the start.
They literally ran out of rifles. They ran out of boots for the soldiers.
And crucially, they ran out of bread for the civilians. The cities were freezing and starving. The entire transport system collapsed under the weight of the war effort.
So that brings us to March 1917, the First Revolution.
This one was spontaneous. It started with women in St. Petersburg marching in the streets begging for bread. The Tsar orders his soldiers to fire on the crowd, and instead the soldiers mutiny and join the women. The regime just evaporates. The Tsar abdicates.
And for a few fleeting months, it looks like Russia might actually become a liberal democracy.
A provisional government takes over. But they make one fatal, catastrophic mistake. They decide to stay in the war. They want to honor their alliance with Britain and France.
Which leaves the door wide open for Vladimir Lenin.
Enter the Bolsheviks. Now, the sources make a really interesting ideological point here about Karl Marx. If you were a betting intellectual in 1900 and you asked Marx, where will the great socialist revolution happen? He would have said Germany. Or maybe Britain.
Because according to Marx's theory, you need advanced industrial capitalism to create an exploited class of urban workers, the proletariat, who will then rise up.
Exactly. But Russia is basically a giant farm. It's overwhelmingly peasant farmers. It shouldn't work, according to the textbook.
So Lenin essentially hacks the ideological code.
He develops what becomes known as Marxism-Leninism. He argues that you don't actually need a spontaneous mass uprising of the majority. What you need is a vanguard party, a small, highly disciplined, ruthless elite of professional revolutionaries to seize power and lead the masses, whether the masses understand the theory or not.
So he arrives back in Russia in late 1917 with a brilliantly simple slogan.
Peace, land, and bread. It was absolute marketing genius. Peace, we will quit this disastrous war immediately. Land, we will take the massive estates from the nobles and give them to the peasants. Bread, we will prioritize feeding the starving cities.
And in November, they make their move.
The Bolshevik Revolution. And it's important to note, it wasn't a mass popular riot. It was a highly coordinated coup d'etat. They seized the telegraph offices, the train stations, the banks, and almost overnight, the world's first communist state is born.
But as history shows us, holding power is much harder than seizing it.
They plunge straight into a brutal civil war. The Red Army versus the White Army. Millions die. The economy is completely annihilated. And this leads to a really fascinating pragmatic pivot by Lenin called the NEP.
The new economic policy.
Lenin looks around and realizes the country is on the brink of total starvation and collapse. So the hardline communist takes a strategic step backward. He reintroduces a little bit of free market capitalism. Peasants are allowed to sell surplus grain for profit. Small retail shops can open.
It's basically a breathing spell for the country.
Exactly. And it worked. The economy slowly recovered. But when Lenin dies in 1924, there is a vicious power struggle. And the man who ultimately wins that struggle, he isn't interested in breathing spells.
We're talking about Stalin.
Joseph Stalin. He represents the shift into pure, unadulterated totalitarianism. He completely scraps the NEP. He launches the 5-year plans.
Which is rapid state-directed industrialization.
State force is a better word. He wants to catch up to the advanced Western economies in 10 years. He builds massive steel mills, hydroelectric dams, tractor factories, but the human cost is just unfathomable.
This is where collectivization comes in, right? Topic 8.6 touches on these totalitarian control mechanisms.
Yes. Stalin violently seizes all the agricultural land from the peasants to form massive state-run farms. When the slightly wealthier peasants, the kulaks, resist, he crushes them. In Ukraine, this intentional policy leads to the Holodomor, a man-made artificial famine designed specifically to break Ukrainian nationalism. Millions of people starve to death while the Soviet government is literally exporting grain abroad to buy foreign machinery.
It's the very definition of a state eating its own people to build industrial power.
And he doesn't stop with the peasants. He purges his own party, the Great Terror. Anyone who could even potentially challenge his authority, the top generals of the Red Army, the old Bolsheviks who fought alongside Lenin, they are subjected to show trials, executed, or sent to the Gulag labor camps in Siberia. Total subordination of the individual to the state.
So that's the left-wing version of totalitarianism. But over in Western Europe, in Italy and Germany, A different kind of monster is rising.
Mm.
Let's shift to fascism.
We need to be very precise here for the AP exam. Fascism and communism hated each other. They literally fought bloody battles in the streets. But functionally, in terms of how they govern, they use the exact same toolkit.
What is fascism, really? It's a word that gets thrown around a lot today as a generic insult, but in the 1920s, it was a very specific political ideology.
It was hyper-nationalist, it was fiercely anti-democratic and anti-communist, it glorified militarism, but crucially, to people traumatized by the war and the weak democratic governments that followed, it promised action. It promised to restore national pride and glory through the absolute unity of the people behind a single, strong, infallible leader.
And Benito Mussolini invents this playbook in Italy.
He's the prototype. He uses his black shirts, a paramilitary group of angry war veterans, to beat up communists and break up labor strikes. He presents himself to the Italian middle class as the only man tough enough to restore order and stop a communist revolution.
And Adolf Hitler is watching this all happen from Germany.
Hitler takes Mussolini's structural blueprint, but he injects it with a virulent pseudoscientific racial element. And in Germany, the cultural soil was incredibly toxic, making it fertile ground for this to grow. You had the deep humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. You had the stab-in-the-back myth, this dangerous anti-Semitic lie that the German army hadn't actually lost the war on the battlefield, but was betrayed by Jews and leftists back home.
And Hitler had a terrifying gift for oratory.
He was a master demagogue. He channeled the raw anger of that lost generation. And the Nazi Party used modern technology brilliantly, radio broadcasts, massive choreographed rallies, the propaganda of Joseph Goebbels, the films of Leni Riefenstahl, to create a cult of personality that was practically a religion.
But here's the crucial point we need to make. Anger and good speeches alone do not get a radical dictator elected in a modern country. You need absolute desperation. Which brings us to slice third, economic collapse.
Topic 8.5, the Great Depression. This is the ultimate trigger. Without the economic collapse of the Depression, Hitler probably remains a fringe radical lunatic screaming in a Munich beer hall.
Explain the house of cards economy of the 1920s that set this up.
It was essentially a massive international triangle of debt. The United States was the world's bank. American banks lent massive amounts of money to Germany to help stabilize them. Germany took that American money and used it to pay their Versailles reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France then took that exact same money and sent it right back to the United States to pay off their own massive wartime debts.
So the money is literally just moving in a giant circle.
Right. And as long as the American economy is roaring in the 1920s, the circle keeps spinning. But in October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashes.
That tap completely turns off.
American banks panic and call in their foreign loans. They say, Germany, we need that money back immediately. Germany says, we don't have it. The German economy collapses almost overnight. Without German reparations, the British and French economies follow. It is a domino effect of global economic interdependence.
And the unemployment numbers from the sources are just staggering.
In Germany, unemployment hits 40%. Middle-class families who thought they were secure are suddenly starving. People lose their entire life savings due to bank failures.
And when you are that desperate, when your kids are hungry, you don't vote for the moderate politician who says, well, we need to balance the budget and tighten our belt.
No, you absolutely don't. You vote for the extremist who points a finger and says, I know exactly who did this to you. It's the international bankers. It's the Jews. It's the politicians who signed the Versailles Treaty. Give me total power and I will fix it. If you look at the historical data, the rise of the Nazi vote traps almost perfectly, line for line, with the rise in the unemployment graph. Economic instability plus national humiliation equals totalitarianism.
And meanwhile, the established democracies, Britain, France, the U.S., they are completely paralyzed by their own economic crises.
They turn completely inward. They put up massive protectionist tariffs to try and save their own domestic industries, which just completely kills what's left of global trade. They are struggling just to keep their own lights on, so they have zero political energy or public support to police the rest of the world.
Which leads directly to the failure of diplomacy, topic 8.7.
The dictators sense this weakness, and they start testing the waters. Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. The League of Nations writes a stern report saying, hey, stop that, you can't do that. Japan basically says, make us, and just quits the League.
And nothing happens. No military response.
Nothing happens. Mussolini is watching this. He invades Ethiopia in 1935 to build his Roman Empire. He uses poison gas against civilians. The League imposes some very weak economic sanctions, but they deliberately don't shut off the one thing that mattered, oil. Mussolini conquers Ethiopia.
And Hitler's watching all of this very, very closely.
And he realizes the democracies are hollow, so he starts to push the boundaries of Versailles. He openly rebuilds the army illegal, he builds an air force, the Luftwaffe illegal, and then in 1936 he takes a massive gamble and marches his troops into the demilitarized Rhineland.
The sources emphasize this specific moment. They call it the biggest missed opportunity of the 20th century.
It absolutely was. The German generals were terrified. They had secret orders from Hitler to turn around and run away immediately if the French army showed up. The French army was massive at that point. They could have easily crushed Hitler right there and ended the Nazi threat in an afternoon.
So why didn't they? Why did they just let him do it?
This is where we have to be empathetic to the psychology of the time. We call it appeasement now, and we use it as an insult. But the French and British leaders, men like Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, they weren't cowards. They were deeply traumatized men.
They remembered the trenches of World War I.
They remembered losing an entire generation of young men. They looked at the casualty lists from battles like the Somme and Verdun and said, we will do absolutely anything diplomatically possible to avoid doing that again. Plus, they were dealing with the Depression, they couldn't afford a war, and many of them secretly believed that Versailles had been too harsh, and that Hitler was a rational actor who just wanted to unite German-speaking people.
They kept saying, he just wants to correct the unfair treaty. If we give him what he wants, he'll calm down.
So they let him annex Austria the Anschluss. Then comes the crisis over the Sudetenland, a German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia.
Which leads to the Munich Conference in 1938.
The absolute high watermark of appeasement. Britain and France literally hand over a massive chunk of a sovereign democracy, Czechoslovakia, to Nazi Germany without even inviting the Czechs to the meeting, all in exchange for Hitler's promise that this is his last territorial demand. Chamberlain flies back to London, waves a piece of paper with Hitler's signature, and declares he has secured peace for our time.
And then, barely 6 months later, Hitler just rolls his tanks in and takes the rest of Czechoslovakia anyway.
And that's the moment the blinders finally come off. Everyone in London and Paris realizes you cannot satisfy a tiger by feeding it steaks. It will always want more.
But the final diplomatic shock, the one that truly signaled that war was inevitable, comes in August 1939.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact.
This makes absolutely no sense on paper. Fascists and communists are mortal ideological enemies. Hitler literally wrote a book about destroying communism.
It was pure, terrifying cynicism on both sides. Hitler wanted to invade Poland, but he desperately wanted to avoid a two-front war. He didn't want to fight the British in the West and the Russians in the East at the same time. Stalin, on the other hand, had just purged all his best generals and desperately needed time to rebuild his military. So these arch-enemies shook hands over the corpse of Eastern Europe. They signed a public non-aggression pact, and they signed a secret protocol to divide Poland between them.
And that cleared the path. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland.
And the world breaks for the second time. Topic 8.8, World War II.
If World War I was entirely about stasis and trenches, World War II is entirely about speed.
Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The Germans had analyzed the stalemate of 1918 and developed a terrifying new doctrine. They integrated fast-moving Panzer tank divisions, screaming Stuka dive bombers, and coordinated it all with two-way radios. They didn't spread out and push the enemy line. They concentrated their force, punched a hole right through, and surrounded the enemy before they could react.
Poland falls in a matter of weeks. But the real global shock is what happens to France.
France had the biggest land army in Europe. They had built the Maginot Line, this massive, state-of-the-art system of concrete fortifications. Everyone in the world thought it would be another brutal 4-year trench stalemate. Germany bypassed the forts, drove through the Ardennes forest, and conquered France in just 6 weeks in 1940.
6 weeks. That completely and utterly upended the global balance of power. Suddenly, Hitler controls the entire continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Soviet border.
And Britain is left standing completely alone. This is Churchill's darkest hour, the Blitz. British civilians sleeping down in the subway tunnels while the German Luftwaffe relentlessly bombs London and Coventry night after night. Total war targeting civilians.
But then Hitler makes the classic fatal mistake of European conquerors, the exact same mistake Napoleon made.
Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. Hitler breaks the pact and launches the largest land invasion in human history against the Soviet Union.
Why do it then, when Britain is still fighting?
Because of his core ideology, he despised communism. And his racial theories demanded Lebensraum, living space in the East for the German people, which meant eradicating the Slavic populations. He fundamentally underestimated the Soviets. He famously said, "You just have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down."
Instead, he got the brutal Russian winter and the sheer, endless manpower of the Red Army.
The Eastern Front is where World War II was really won and lost in Europe. The scale of the violence is almost impossible to comprehend. Millions of men clashing. The Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, that was the ultimate turning point. An entire massive German army was surrounded, starved, and destroyed in the ruins of the city. It permanently broke the offensive spine of the German military.
Meanwhile, the war expands across the globe. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941.
Which brings the United States fully into the war, and from an industrial standpoint, this seals the fate of the Axis powers. You simply cannot defeat the combined industrial manufacturing might of the U.S., the inexhaustible manpower of the Soviet Union, and the global empire of Great Britain.
The U.S. becomes the arsenal of democracy.
We mobilized our economy to a level that was mind-boggling. We produced more planes, more tanks, more ships than anyone thought statistically possible. Ford was building bombers instead of cars. We were launching a new Liberty cargo ship every few days. The Allies didn't just outfight the Axis, they simply overwhelmed them with an avalanche of material.
Then you have D-Day in 1944. The Western Front reopens. The vice slowly closes on Germany from both sides.
But as the Allied armies push into German-occupied territory, they discover something that wasn't on any military map. And this is topic 8.9, the Holocaust.
We really need to slow down and be analytical here. We've talked about war crimes, we've talked about civilians dying in bombings, but this was fundamentally different from anything in history.
It was. And for the AP student analyzing this, the key concept to grasp is that it was industrialized. It was bureaucratic.
It wasn't a spontaneous riot. It wasn't a massacre committed in the heat of battle by angry soldiers.
No, it was a deliberate, state-sponsored project. The sources highlight the Wannsee Conference in early 1942. You have 15 high-ranking Nazi officials, many of them highly educated, cultured men with PhDs, sitting around the table in a nice villa. They aren't screaming with rage. They are drinking cognac and calmly discussing the logistics of the final solution to the Jewish question.
They treated the eradication of a people like a standard corporate logistics problem.
Exactly. How do we alter the railway schedules to transport millions of people? What is the most cost-effective chemical gas to use? How many ovens do we need to build to dispose of the bodies at scale? It was chillingly, horrifyingly rational in its methodology, but completely insane in its ideological goal.
And the end result of that meeting was the creation of the death camps.
Yeah.
Places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor.
These were not just harsh prisons or labor camps. They were literal factories designed for the sole purpose of producing death. They used modern IBM punch card technology to relentlessly catalog their victims. They used the European railway network. They used advanced chemical engineering for the Zyklon B gas chambers.
It connects right back to what we talked about in the intro, the idea of 19th century progress. The Nazis utilized all of that progress, corporate organization, modern technology, industrial efficiency, and weaponize it to commit mass murder.
6 million Jewish people were systematically murdered, along with millions of others targeted by Nazi racial pseudoscience, the Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, people with physical and mental disabilities, political dissidents. It was a terrifying attempt to biologically re-engineer the human race through industrial slaughter.
And when the Allied soldiers finally liberated those camps, the footage and the images that came out shattered whatever tiny shred of optimism was left in the Western world.
Which leads us perfectly into topic 8.9, the shattering of optimism, the cultural and intellectual shifts. Because you simply cannot go through the meat grinder of 2 world wars and the horrors of the Holocaust and just go back to painting pretty landscapes and writing poetry about human nobility.
The culture fundamentally changed. The psychological foundation cracked.
The 19th century was all about certainty. Newtonian physics told us the universe was a predictable clockwork machine. Enlightenment philosophy told us humans were inherently rational. The 20th century violently tore all of that down. It became the era of uncertainty and irrationality.
You see it in science first, right?
Yes. In physics, you have Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. You have Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. They proved mathematically that the universe isn't stable or objectively knowable. Reality literally depends on the perspective of the observer.
And in psychology, you have Sigmund Freud.
Freud drops a bomb on the Enlightenment idea of the rational human. He argues that we aren't rational actors at all. We are driven by deep, unconscious, often dark and aggressive urges. We're basically just animals wearing nice suits, pretending to be civilized until the stress gets too high.
And how does that manifest in the arts?
You see a complete fragmentation. The Dadaism movement after World War I making art that is intentionally absurd and nonsensical, like a urinal sign with a fake name, because the world itself no longer makes any sense. You have the lost generation of writers like Hemingway and Remarque writing about the utter futility and emptiness of modern life.
And philosophically, you have the rise of existentialism.
Right, thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, the realization that there is no grand inherent meaning or divine plan to the universe. God is dead, as Nietzsche said earlier, and we are left completely alone to figure it out in the ruins. It's a philosophy built for a society that has stared directly into the abyss.
So as we bring this deep dive in for a landing, let's synthesize all of this. We started on a sunny terrace in 1913. We end in the nuclear shadow of 1945. What is the ultimate legacy of this era?
The primary synthesis is that the era of European global dominance is permanently over. Europe in 1945 is in complete ruins. It is militarily and ideologically divided right down the middle by the Iron Curtain.
And the grand empires that started the century.
They are essentially dead men walking. Britain and France might have won the war, but they are completely bankrupt. They can no longer afford the military or economic cost of holding on to their vast colonies. The massive wave of global decolonization is about to explode across Africa and Asia.
So the center of gravity shifts entirely.
It shifts to the edges, to Washington, D.C. and to Moscow. The United States and the Soviet Union emerge as the undisputed global superpowers. The hot war of World War II ends, but the Cold War framework locks into place almost immediately. The global ideological struggle between Western liberal democracy and Soviet communism becomes the new organizing principle of the entire planet.
So to directly answer our guiding question for the AP learner, how did this shattered century transform the world?
Industrialized warfare made the cost of great power conflict totally unsustainable. Ideological extremism, the rise of fascism and totalitarian communism polarized the globe and destroyed the old 19th century liberal order. And the massive economic collapse of the Great Depression proved that unregulated laissez-faire capitalism simply couldn't survive the pressures of a highly interconnected modern world.
We essentially broke the world through total war and atrocity, and then we desperately tried to glue it back together with new international institutions like the United Nations, the IMF, and the terrifying deterrent of nuclear weapons.
And the reality is we are still living inside that glued-together house today. Every headline you read today has its roots in this specific 30-year window.
Which brings me to a final, provocative thought for you to chew on after you finish listening. We spent all this time studying the history of the 20th century. But think deeply about the concept of the progress trap. The brilliant minds of the 19th century genuinely believed that scientific and technological progress would automatically elevate human morality. They thought better machines would make better people.
And the 20th century proved, with horrifying clarity, that technology just amplifies whatever we already are. It can build a hospital, or it can build a death camp.
Exactly. And as we look at our world today, we are living through another massive explosion of technical progress.
Oh!
Artificial intelligence, bioengineering, cyber capabilities. We are building things faster than ever.
The ultimate question the 20th century leaves us with is this: has our human morality actually caught up to our technology? Or are we just as blindly arrogant, just as fragile as those men drinking coffee in Vienna in 1913, completely oblivious to the cliff we are rapidly walking toward?
That is definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the shattered century.
Keep thinking critically, keep questioning the narrative, and good luck with your study.
We will see you next time.